The most expensive naval defense system ever built has a blind spot, 12 miles wide, and every adversary with a calculator already knows exactly where it is. Salt air, 6 in the morning, the flight deck of a Nimitz-class carrier, 90,000 tons of steel turning slowly into the wind, jets lined up in organized chaos that looks like catastrophe and runs like clockwork. Somewhere above the South China Sea, a strike group commander is staring at a threat board that shows him everything. 3 layers of defense, $40 billion of combined architecture, destroyers at 30 miles, cruisers at 15, point defense systems at 3 miles, and at 12 miles, a gap that physics has never fully closed. He knows it. His engineers know it. The question eating at him is simple. Does the adversary know it too? Because in modern naval warfare, the number that gets you killed is not the one on the missile. It is the $13 billion number, the one that makes everyone assume the problem is already solved. The carrier strike group did not come from a drawing board. It came from wreckage. From the Falklands in 1982, where HMS Sheffield burned for 6 days after a single Exocet hit, and the Royal Navy realized that prestige does not stop a sea-skimming missile. From the Persian Gulf in 1988, where USS Vincennes fired on a civilian aircraft because the terminal decision window had collapsed to seconds and a human being had to choose. From every engagement where a ship built to project power discovered at the worst possible moment that it was also a target. The lessons were written in steel and doctrine. The strike group became the answer. Around the carrier, the formation arranges itself in concentric rings of calculated violence. The outermost ring is electronic, EA-18G growlers jamming radar frequencies before a launch even achieves a firing solution. The next ring is kinetic, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, each carrying 96 VLS cells, 96 loaded weapons waiting for a coordinate, a revolver the size of a building pointing everywhere at once. Then the Ticonderoga-class cruiser running Aegis, tracking 300 contacts within 200 nautical miles simultaneously, seeing the sky the way a chess grandmaster sees a board, every piece, every trajectory, every implication before the opponent finishes moving. At 3 miles, the Phalanx close-in weapon system fires depleted uranium rounds at 4,500 per minute. The sound is not a burst, it is a sustained mechanical scream, like a turbine tearing itself apart, and then silence, and then the threat is gone. This is what $13 billion builds. This is what $13 billion protects. And then, between 3 miles and 12 miles, the architecture gets complicated. This is where geometry becomes the villain. Not a nation, not a commander, geometry. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 nautical miles at its narrowest point, and physics calls that a kill zone. When a supersonic anti-ship missile travels at Mach 2.5 and skims the wave surface at 4 to 8 meters altitude, it compresses the available intercept window between 12 and 20 seconds. The Aegis system, extraordinary at altitude, extraordinary at range, was optimized for threats descending from high above. When a threat arrives flat, hugging the radar horizon, the geometry shifts. The mathematics of intercept require a minimum engagement range. Below 12 miles, at terminal velocity, the window begins to collapse, not disappear, collapse. The distinction matters enormously. 3 officers who participated in the USS Cole damage assessment, speaking on background to Naval Institute proceedings, each described the terminal gap differently. One called the window manageable, one called it marginal, one said it depended entirely on the day and the geometry and how many threats arrived at once. That disagreement has never been publicly resolved, and the adversary has read every word of those same proceedings. Here is what $13 billion does not buy. A single YJ-112 supersonic anti-ship missile, Chinese-manufactured, export variants documented across regional arsenals, costs approximately $200,000.
At Mach 4 in terminal phase, at 12 miles out, it gives the strike group's inner defensive layer between 7 and 11 seconds to detect, classify, track, assign, and fire. The SM-2 Standard missile, the primary medium-range interceptor, costs $2.1 million per round. The SM-6, the upgraded variant now deployed for terminal defense, costs $4.3 million. A salvo of 8 YJ-12 missiles costs $1.6 million to launch. It requires $34 million in interceptors to defeat, and that assumes 100% intercept probability on every single shot. Adversary planners do not assume 100%. They plan around 70 to 80, which means in a 16-missile saturation strike, the terminal math changes completely. Not because the system fails, because simultaneous intercepts create a sequencing problem that no software update has fully solved. $4.3 million per shot, 11 seconds per decision. The adversary already ran that math. They ran it years ago. He was 33 years old. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, Tactical Action Officer on board a Burke-class destroyer during a 2020 Freedom of Navigation transit through contested waters in the Western Pacific. 13 years in the Navy. This was his first real engagement posture, not a simulation, not a training exercise, a live threat environment with classified rules of engagement and a carrier 1 nautical mile off his port beam. He told the post-deployment debrief the system was showing him 17 contacts. 3 were ambiguous. He had 9 seconds to decide which 3 to watch and which 14 to trust the algorithm on. He was not thinking about doctrine. He was thinking about the sequencing problem, the one the engineers had briefed him on at Dahlgren the previous spring, and whether the software update that was supposed to address it had actually been loaded to his ship. It had been loaded. What he didn't know was whether it had been tested against a simultaneous high-low attack profile at the exact geometry he was now facing. It had not been tested, not against that profile, not at that range. He made a decision. The contacts resolved as non-hostile, but the official record notes that had those contacts been real, the engagement window would have been 9 seconds from first detection to last viable intercept. 3 officers present that day gave 3 different accounts of the exact sequence afterward. The official record reflects one version. The other 2 remain in debrief transcripts that have not been made public. That gap between the official version and what the men in the room remember has never been explained. The threat was managed, the vulnerability was not, and this is the part that the $13 billion number obscures. The strike group does not need to be impenetrable. It needs to be too expensive to attack. The calculation is never, can we stop every missile? The calculation is, can we make the cost of launching them, in aircraft destroyed, in infrastructure targeted, in retaliation that follows, high enough that the adversary's math never reaches a launch decision? That has worked for a specific category of adversary, operating under a specific set of strategic constraints, facing a specific political cost structure. It has worked, until the adversary redesigns their math around the 12 miles that remain. Somewhere in 2025, a Navy that is not the United States Navy conducted a combined drone and missile saturation exercise against a simulated carrier target. The results were not published. The exercise was not announced through any official channel. But the parameters, simultaneous high-altitude and wave-skimming profiles, mixed subsonic and supersonic sequencing, coordinated electronic spoofing timed to the terminal intercept window, were described in open-source defense analysis as specifically engineered to stress terminal intercept geometry. The last 12 miles. Again. Does that sound like it ended? If you know someone who works in naval systems, in fleet operations, in defense procurement, they need to see this. The system is not broken. That is the hardest thing to hold in your mind about $13 billion. It works. It works at long range with a precision that would have seemed impossible to the engineers who first drew the Aegis concept in 1969. It works against ballistic trajectories, against aircraft, against mid-envelope cruise missiles, against threat categories that previous generations couldn't even track. And at 12 miles, it works most of the time, under most conditions, against most attack profiles. The men and women who crew these ships understand exactly what that word means, most. They run the numbers every deployment. They train against the edge cases. They know that the last 12 miles is not a failure of engineering. It is a confrontation with physics that no funding level has yet fully resolved. The real question, the one that keeps program officers awake and fleet commanders running simulations at 3 in the morning, is whether an adversary who has read the same physics and run the same terminal geometry has built their entire offensive doctrine around the 11 seconds that fall between most and all. That is not a hypothetical scenario. That is a design specification written into the weapons being built right now. And the $13 billion shield, that number, that assumption, that belief